Hi, Michael.
Hi, Laura. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks for asking. And welcome everybody to today's webinar on how to use EMC and radio testing for compliance and global market access, in particular when applying to multiple similar equipment models. My name is Laura Llewellyn, and I'll be hosting today's webinar. It's my pleasure to introduce Michael Darby. He's our radio expert and technical director within our Connected Technologies division. Michael's worked as a manufacturer, test engineer and certification body throughout his career. He's a notified body for the EU and an approved body for the UK. And he's also a certification body for the FCC and Canada. He's an active member of the EU Notified Body Group, the vice chair of the TCB Council Board of Directors, and he's also responsible for many technical papers on radio testing, approvals and integration of radio connectivity into other equipment. Michael is also a well-known trainer, teacher, and has delivered numerous seminars and webinars throughout his career. And finally, for me, if you do have any questions for Michael, please submit these on the GoToWebinar panel to the right-hand side of your screen. Thank you. Over to you, Michael.
Thanks very much, Laura. I'll now share my slides. Okay, thanks, Laura. So today I want to talk to you about testing and authorization for selling your products or placing your products on the market around the world, with a big focus on multiple models of products. So that's me. My name is Michael Darby. I'm a technical director in our Connected Technologies department at Element Materials. So today I'm going to talk about testing and approvals for regulatory compliance. I'm going to focus on the North American and European market. And there's a few reasons for that. Firstly, they are the most common regions that everyone wants to sell to. Secondly, a lot of the world's regulatory compliances uses those two routes as part of their own regulatory compliance. And thirdly, because those two regions represent two quite different compliance approaches. And so I'm going to use those almost as case studies to demonstrate some of the differences. So we're going to talk a lot about what happens if you've got multiple models of the same type of product. So very similar products, and you want to test and authorize multiple products or multiple similar models. If you'd seen the advertisement that this webinar was all about multiple models, and you realize now it's about hardware variations of radio equipment, I apologize for your disappointment. We're going to go over the testing and authorization requirements for North America and Europe, and we'll have some time for questions and answers at the end. Okay, so, well, what's the big problem? This shouldn't really be a topic, should it? You know, if you've got regulatory compliance, it's really easy. It's clearly defined. Everybody understands it. There's nothing to worry about. You've got a product. You've made the product. You test the product. You also authorize the product. Maybe it's certification. Maybe it's declaration of conformity or some other procedure. You sell the product. You make a lot of money. You're retired. If you've got multiple products, well, you just go through that same process multiple times. You test multiple products, you authorize multiple products, and you sell multiple versions of all of those products. Maybe you retire even earlier. So if you've got multiple products and you've simply been multiplying that process, then that's fine, and that is correct. But people are always kind of a bit curious. Well, what if I've got multiple similar products? Do I really have to multiply every step in the process, or is there some cost or time savings that can be achieved? So there are ways of finding improvement. If you've got multiple similar products, for a start, you'll become very familiar with the testing. If you've gone to a test lab once for one product, that will seem like a new experience to you. But if you go over and over again for multiple products, then obviously you're going to become familiar with your testing. It's going to be easier for you to understand the worst case mode of your product, the worst case setup, the worst case operating conditions. Also, you'll become very familiar with the paperwork. If you're going through a certification process or applying for a type examination certificate, then all of that paperwork and all the admin will become very simple for you, and it'll be a quicker process for you to get your product on the market and sell more products. So that's good news. But of course, people are always asking, what else can be done? Obviously, I'm achieving some economies of scale by getting through the process faster, but is there anything else that can be done? And in some regions, the answer is yes, but in other regions, I would say be careful. So let's have a look at that now. People often think of this whole regulatory approvals as being test and approvals, really one topic. I'll test my product and then it's approved, or my product's approved and therefore it must pass the tests. But actually, in reality, these are two separate topics. They're closely linked, but they are very different topics. Testing is one topic and approvals is another. So let's start with the North American market. And when I say North American, I'm really focusing here on the United States of America and Canada. So the assessment scope for those two regions, really for kind of radio-enabled electronic equipment, is RF exposure safety, EMC emissions, and radio transmitter performance. Those are the main things. They don't really deal with EMC immunity in most cases, and product safety is important in North America, but it's not part of the regulatory process. And the radio receiver tests are not part of the requirements yet. So the authorization routes through the FCC and ISED Canada are split into two different parts. If you've got electronic devices or digital devices or radio receivers, these can typically be authorized through the supplier's declaration of conformity route. The radio transmitters, on the other hand, typically require certification. And the certification process for North America is very much a check, certification, and registration of the product. So let's have a quick look first about this Supplier's Declaration of Conformity, or SDOC as it's known. It's an authorization procedure or a process. It doesn't simply mean that you provide a DOC document. In fact, there's no requirement to provide a DOC document. There are compliance statements that you would put in the user manual, and there's information you need to provide, for example, the name and address of a company in America or Canada. But it's not a declaration of conformity document. It's a clearly defined procedure. And the procedure involves testing the correct way to the correct standards and maintaining the documents and the compliance of your products. So at any point, if somebody wants to check the compliance of your product, they would ask you for the test reports, and you would be expected to provide real set of complete test reports and test results of the model that they have in their hand. So if somebody has a unit in their hand and they say, send me the test report for this one, you should be able to provide it. So testing is a mandatory step in the authorization process for SDOC. You compile and keep the technical data, and you label the product with compliance statements. Meanwhile, certification, which is also a formal authorization procedure, it's very similar actually. You test the correct way to the correct standards. You do need to use an accredited lab that's been listed with the FCC or Canada. You maintain the documents and evidence of compliance, and you make sure you're always selling a compliant product. But there's an additional step with certification where there's a certification body reviewing the test reports and the documentation and registering the equipment on the TCB, on the FCC's website or the ISED Canada's website. So that certification body is typically known as a TCB in the USA or an FCB for Canada. So as you can see, very similar. Testing is a mandatory step in the authorization process. Manufacturer compiles the required data, submits all the information, and receives the FCC grant and the ISED certificate and radio equipment listing from the certification body. So here we go. It's pretty simple. What have we learned so far then about North American authorizations? Well, you can't get through it without correctly testing the product. Testing the product is a mandatory step in the process, and it's clearly written in the rules. You can't avoid testing and somehow hope that your authorization would still be legal or valid, because it won't. The authorization is a process and procedure. Even the SDOC is a process and procedure where correct testing of each product is a mandatory step. And of course, the same with certification. It's easier to see that with certification because, of course, somebody's checking your homework. If you don't correctly follow the process or the procedure, then the product is not correctly authorized. So who is this certification body, or TCB or FCB, that I've talked about, and what freedoms or flexibilities or power do they have? Well, the TCB or FCB has a very clear role in the certification procedure. As we've just learnt, correct testing to the correct standard is a mandatory step in the process. So the TCB or FCB isn't there to kind of allow the manufacturer through in cases that they haven't tested. The TCB or FCB's role is to check that the manufacturer really has tested correctly. So when you submit a project to the TCB has to check the application and compare it to the published rules from the FCC or from ISED Canada. They're checking that all the tests have been performed and have been performed correctly on all models and all products. The TCB cannot deviate from the rules or interpret the rules differently, and they can't suddenly wave a magic wand and allow the manufacturer to deviate from rules either. If a manufacturer does not test correctly, the TCB can't make some interpretation that they think it's okay. They have to say, I'm afraid your certification cannot proceed. And the TCB is told very clearly that they cannot act as an advocate for the manufacturer. They're really there to police the rules. The same applies for the FCC's SDOC and Canada's SDOC. The only difference is, in that case, the manufacturer or their in-country responsible party does that. So it's the manufacturer's responsibility to check that all of their models have been tested correctly to the correct standards in the correct procedures before the manufacturer signs the report and places their product on the market through the SDOC process. So there are some very good reasons why the correct testing is so important then. Well, obviously, the FCC and ISED authorization depends on it. If you haven't tested correctly and you go to the TCB should reject the application and tell you you've got to go back and test it correctly. It's actually really important with the SDOC procedure for electronic devices and the EMC testing, because the TCB isn't there to check your homework. So in that case, it's up to the manufacturer and their test lab to ensure that testing really was done correctly on all models of all variants. For TCBs have to do audit surveillance testing on 5% of the products that they certify. So there's a very strong chance that your product could be called in for audit surveillance testing after you've had it certified. It will be tested and it has to meet two criteria. Firstly, of course, it has to pass the FCC and ISED rules. But secondly, the results have to match and be the same as they were during the test and certification stage. So obviously, if you've not correctly tested a product, or if you've somehow tried to put a non-tested variant model through, and then that product gets audit surveillance testing, the results may not match. And there, of course, it highlights the fact that that product wasn't authorized. But also for the manufacturer, if you want to make some change to your product and you go back at a later date, there'll be some comparison testing, and we'll talk a moment about permissive changes, and you'll see then that the manufacturer at some points will have to demonstrate that their product hasn't changed by comparing test results. So a manufacturer then has fully tested their product, they've certified it, or maybe they've done the SDOC route and therefore they've legally authorized their product. Then somebody changes their product. Maybe their own team decides to make improvements to the product. Maybe some parts or components have gone obsolete. Maybe the engineers simply got bored and saw a way of improving it. But ultimately, a product has become changed and a new variant model has been created. Now, the product might look the same, might even have the same model number. It may have a slightly different model number, but it's really probably in your minds, you might say, well, it's the same product, it's got a different SKU, maybe it's made in a different factory, different suppliers of components, But the bottom line is you've changed a product. If the transmitter hardware has changed, most of us know, therefore it would require a new certification. So if there's a radio transmitter in your product and it's been certified, then a new certification is needed if you change the transmitter hardware. In almost all cases, this is going to result in full retesting. There are some cases where the data reuse or data referencing KDB can be used and partial test data is accepted, but still full evidence needs to be provided. However, if the transmitter hardware is the same and there have been some other minor hardware changes to the non-transmitter circuitry, perhaps circuitry that was covered under the SDOC process for your product, then this could be handled under a permissive change. So it's a different authorization procedure, but again, testing is required. So if you have made any kind of minor hardware changes to your product, then of course you need to evaluate, what have I done here? What changes have I made? And that will be done through testing. So I'm going to press pause here for a moment and take you back to my life in the late 1980s, early 1990s. Now, I know what you're thinking. Surely, Michael, you weren't even born in the 1990s. Well, I'm sad to tell you that I was indeed alive and well and working as an EMC test engineer. In fact, I was working for a manufacturer in the early 90s and late 1980s. Developing a product and doing our own in-house EMC testing. So my job was to test a product. If it failed, see what changes I could make to fix the EMC failure. So I was the one who was fixing the EMC failures, or if a product passed, in fact, looking to say, well, what changes could we make to improve the product that would still result in a pass? What did I learn during those very important years in the early stages of my career? Well, I learned some of the really small things that could affect EMC performance. Changing a cable, changing the cable type, changing cable connectors, whether that's the connector on the cable or the cable on the product itself, even little D-type connectors, whether they go inside a case or outside a case, or how they're connected. Types of screws, types of washer, types of metal used for them. Internal cable placement, that was a really important thing. You could move cables inside a product and really see pretty dramatic differences in EMC performance. Any change of components, whether that's changing the component spec or just changing a component supplier or changing the component location, all of these things could affect EMC performance. Moving the location of the board inside the product, so maybe moving it closer to the edge of the case or closer to a power supply or nearer the top of the product, any of these things could make a change. So really, nowadays, when people come to me and say, I've made some hardware changes to my product, but I don't think it will affect EMC emissions, I think back to these days and I think, wow, how on earth could you ever guess this? So I've seen all of these things, changes, cause unexpected EMC results. And really, anybody who's spent any time working in EMC product improvement or EMC testing, especially back in the manual days before automated testing, you would definitely have seen these things. People think of EMC testing as a bit of an art, but in reality, it's a science that we don't seem to have all the knowledge and all the ingredients to understand. Okay, so let's press play and get back to the main topic. So we've got a product. Let's say it's fully authorized under the SDOC procedure, or maybe just part of the product is authorized as SDOC. We make a change to the product. We've changed a few components. Well, it's not the same product that we tested anymore. And we know that testing is a mandatory step in the authorization process. So, of course, we have to test the product. We then maintain the technical documentation, update our own reports and references, and then provide that new test report to our own responsible party in the USA, or if you are a USA-based manufacturer, just make sure you've signed and kept hold of that test report. If you're making a change to the non-transmitter part of a certified product, again, it's going to need to be tested because there are some hardware changes. Certification product data, which is on the FCC and Canada websites, is different. So a permissive change will be required. And we'll talk a moment about what a permissive change is. But basically, it's a change to a product that is permitted within the scope of its certification. There are a few types of permissive change, and I'm really going to look just here at Class 1 or Class 2 permissive changes. So a Class 1 permissive change is a change which is so minor that the test results are the same or better. So let's say you've got a product, it's certified, you've changed the components, not the transmitter components, but you've changed the non-transmitter components a small amount, you've retested it, and you've found that the test results are the same as they were before, or maybe even better. That then becomes a Class 1 permissive change. What makes a Class 2 permissive change? Well, the same process, you've made some minor hardware changes, you've performed your testing, but you've found that the test results are slightly worse than they were before. So suddenly now, then, the results that are held on the FCC and Canada websites are not representing the worst, because what you've got in your hands now represent the worst. And therefore, with the Class 2 permissive change, you have to update your certification file on record by sending those new results to a TCB. So if it's a Class 1 permissive change, you can keep the results on file. If it's a Class 2 permissive change, you have to send them to the TCB to get them sent to the FCC and Canada websites. Now, people will often ask, if I make this hardware change, will it be a Class 1 or Class 2 permissive change? If you've ever asked that question, it kind of shows that you didn't really understand how any changes can affect EMC performance, and that the whole process is testing, and then the test results will tell you if it's a Class 1 or Class 2. It's hard to predict in many cases. Now, of course, there'll always be some cases where you say, right, well, I've just changed the color of my product, and I've done it by changing from one plastic enclosure to another plastic enclosure, or I've changed the color of the paint. Well, these are probably going to be a Class 1 permissive change then. And there are other things where you can say, look, I've changed the screen, I've put in more connectors, I've changed the keyboard. There's no way the results are going to be the same as before. It's almost certain to be a Class 2 permissive change. But in other cases, it's hard to predict. And it's only when you perform the tests will you find out if you're going for a Class 1 or Class 2 permissive change. If anybody says that they can predict the results without actually doing any testing, then they're probably retired by now and living somewhere glorious because of the magical skills that they possess. So it's really not correct to go to a test lab then and say, if I make this change to my product, will it be a Class 1 or Class 2 permissive change? Because that's, firstly, it's not within the scope of a test lab to do that. And secondly, of course, any advice they give you is simply going to be a guess. Anybody who considers themselves to be an EMC expert, and there are plenty of us around, we could probably have a bit of a guess. We could probably say, yeah, that change might not affect your EMC much, or yeah, this change probably is. But you've always got to remember that they're making a guess for you, and then it's your legal responsibility to act on that guess. And bear in mind that we're talking about North America here, where having test results is a mandatory step in the process. If you try and authorize your product, you're selling your product, and you expect it to have evidence of authorization, which means a test results, and somebody says to you, where's your test results? Saying, well, a guy who claimed to be an EMC expert said to me that he didn't think I'd need them, really isn't going to cut it. Not only for legal points of view that you have to have test results, but also really from an engineering point of view, it is impossible to guess the results of hardware changes which have not been tested. Even depopulation, which some people seem to say, well, presumably my product's EMC will only get better because I took some components out. That really isn't the case. Depopulation can cause emissions to go up or down. And of course, evidence or proof of compliance with the standards is needed because it's part of the process, and it's the manufacturer's responsibility. So the manufacturer has to ask the test lab to perform testing. Well, luckily, of course, for North America, you're only really looking at emissions. You're not looking at all those EMC immunity tests. But be careful of any unexpected consequences. I have had cases in the past where I've changed a product and said, well, I'm sure it's only the radiated emissions that will be affected. And then later on found out that it did also affect the conducted, and vice versa. Okay, so you've got a product then, you've made a change to the product, you've performed some testing on the changed product. Maybe it was SDOC, and so you've just got a new test report to keep. Maybe it was certification, and so you've got a new test report and you've got a permissive change to process. But your new variant is now authorized because you've tested it, you've followed the correct testing procedure, you've labeled it correctly, and you've got everything on record. Everybody's happy, the lab has done the testing, the manufacturer has followed the procedure or process, the new product can now be sold, and you've got a new model authorized. So this is looking at the process in really kind of a serial way. The chronology is one product, tested, certified, or authorized, and then a changed product, tested and authorized. Well, what happens though if you knew in advance that was going to happen and you turned up to the test lab on day one with all of your models and said, well, I've got a family of products here and they're all very, very similar. So they're not exactly the same, but they're similar. Can I test multiple products, or can I include multiple products under one certification? Well, firstly, if it's SDOC, of course, there is no certification. If it's got a transmitter in it, then you could have one certification if you've got multiple very similar products, as long as they are all compliant with the authorization procedures. So let's have a look at that. If you've got multiple modules in one certification, is that okay? And do I need to test them all, or could I test one model and get the certification to cover them all? Well, firstly, the FCC rules does allow you to test one unit and authorize multiple model numbers. However, it says that that's only possible if all of them are identical. Now, of course, it's important to know that the FCC has no interest in model numbers. They don't care about the model number. So what they're saying here is one test per hardware. If you've got multiple models that are all absolutely identical, then of course one test is fine. But if they're not identical, then you do need to test them all. And Canada has the same thing in their certification procedure. If you've got multiple model numbers, now Canada does care about the model number and the marketing names. If you want to use one set of test results to authorize multiple model numbers, then they really need to be identical, or you need to provide the test data or evidence. And again, of course, for the FCC, if you've got any multiple models that are not exactly identical, then of course you're going to have to test them all. So think about life by looking back at that permissive change thing. If you've got a product and you've made a hardware variation to it, we know that you've got to test it because, of course, it's a different product. Now, just think about that same logic, but from day one. So if you turn up with 2 units and say, these 2 units are very, very similar to each other, then you understand, of course, that you're going to have to test them both. If there are hardware changes, it is possible to include them under one certification, but they will both need testing. So let's say, for example, you've got 2 units, they've both got Wi-Fi in them, they've both got the exact same Wi-Fi circuitry, but they've got other parts of hardware that are slightly different, maybe around the power supply or the screen or the connector. Well, you might say the conducted antenna port transmitter tests are the same, so I'll just do those on one of them. But all of those radiated emissions and radiated EIRP tests and conducted emissions, AC emissions, the hardware is different. And so of course, you'll need 2 sets of tests, or however many models there are, that's how many different tests you'll need. So if you've got multiple models, follow that permissive change logic, but do it all in the first place. And I found that people seem to have a mental block with this. If people test a product on day 1 and then a few months later they'll change it, they understand they have to test. And then a few months later they'll change it again and they'll test it again. And people seem happy with that. But if they turn up on day 1 with 3 or 4 models, all slightly different to each other, a lot of people seem to find it harder to understand that they do need to test them all. But if they don't test them all, of course, they're not authorized. Sometimes people will say, well, we want to test the worst one. You know, we make 4 models that they're all slightly different to each other, but we've tested the worst one here. Well, have you got proof? You need to have proof, you need to have evidence, you need to have test results. It's not simply a case of saying we've got lots of units here, we tested the most fully loaded one, or we tested the one with most buttons, we tested one and all the others were depopulated versions of the same. None of those statements make any sense from an engineering point of view, and none of those statements are legally correct from an authorization point of view either. If you made any hardware variations, you need test results for them all. So it's not authorized if there's no test evidence. And of course, everybody knows that unknown changes can cause unknown EMC effects. So let's say, for example, you've got Model A and Model B, and they're slightly similar, or maybe they're identical. What can be done with North America? Well, let's say you've fully tested Model A and partially tested Model B. Basically, a test lab must test what they're told to test. The whole job of a test lab is not to provide consultancy or advice, or of course, labs are under a lot of pressure to do so. A lab's job is to test what it's told to test and report what it's actually tested, and then show evidence for compliance for testing. So if you've got Model A and Model B and they're absolutely identical, you could test one of them and the report could state that therefore Model A and B both pass because they're identical, of course. If there's minor hardware changes between them and you've asked the lab to fully test one of them and partially test the other one, then that's what the lab must report. They must report what they actually did. And then the manufacturer, hopefully you've got to check that you really do have evidence of test results for compliance. It's very important to remember the role of the lab and the manufacturer is very clear here. So for getting a product to market on time, I've seen people spend weeks and weeks trying to justify why they avoided a 2-hour test. And you've got to remember that time to market is critical here. Now, labs are all trying to be the most popular lab and be the lab that manufacturers like. And often a manufacturer wants the lab to say, you don't need to test this variant. It probably won't have any different results. But you've got to ask yourself as a manufacturer, is the lab helping you there if you've got hardware variation and you've got no test results for it? For a start, you don't actually know if it will pass or fail. And secondly, of course, it wouldn't be legally authorized if you sold it anyway. So really, you've got to pick your battles as when it's time to take risks or when it's time to do the test and do it correctly. So the takeaway of this section for North America, certification and SDOC isn't just about does it pass or fail, it's about actually having test results. And for certification, it's registering that design of that product and what the results look like with the FCC in Canada. And you must have test results for each end product. The design and the results on file represent the product you're going to sell. And if you make any changes to your product, then you need to process that through a permissive change or by updating your SDOC documentation. Some common mistakes for North America, trying to add new models without any test data. So we've noticed that as a test lab, we've noticed it as a certification body, and ISED Canada and the FCC have both noticed it and are paying a lot of attention to it at the moment. asking the lab to test, asking the test lab to report that they did test non-tested models, or to state that a non-tested model complies, which a test lab should not be doing. A lot of people thinking, well, I suspect my results would lead to a class 1 permissive change, and therefore I don't think I need to test. That is really not a correct statement. You test, and then the results will tell you if it's a class 1 or class 2 permissive change. It's not correct to say we expect it will be class 1 and therefore we don't test. That's not correct. And having minor changes. Now, I do appreciate the difficulty of a manufacturer where you might constantly be making really small changes to the hardware, and I appreciate you might have some business decisions to make and some business risks to make. But I'm just here to tell you and to remind you that there's nothing in the FCC rules or the Canadian standards to say that minor changes are permitted without testing. There's nothing to say that. So if you're making minor changes and you're not testing, those are your decisions to make. Not correctly either. Not tracking changes that you've made to your product. You know, if you are making component changes and if you are making taking risks by not retesting, then as the compliance manager, you really need to be on top of that. Not correctly authorizing all the models, thinking this is easy, and guessing worst case modes. Okay, let's travel across the Atlantic now to Europe. Specifically, I'm going to talk about the Radio Equipment Directive for the European Union, but a lot of the same logic applies to the UKCA marking for the UK. So the Radio Equipment Directive is a trade directive. It's not a technical document, although it does include Article 3, which mandates that the manufacturer must assess their product. There's only one authorization route through the RED, and that's declaration of conformity, and there is no certification to the RED. So the RED assessment scope is product safety, which includes RF exposure and all other safety aspects. EMC performance, that's EMC emissions and immunity. Radio performance, that's transmitter and receiver, and some other categories. So, for example, cell phones' ability to make emergency calls. And later on, midway through 2024, of course, we expect cybersecurity to be added. So the RED's declaration of conformity, it's one declaration by the manufacturer to state that every aspect of their product complies. Now, the manufacturer has a choice of procedures, a choice of authorization routes that they may take. It's not as clear-cut as with the FCC, where you only had one choice. With Europe, with the Radio Equipment Directive, the manufacturer chooses how to assess their product as long as it takes them to this final stage where they sign their declaration of conformity to say, my product meets the directive. So that DOC, or Declaration of Conformity, is a document that the manufacturer provides with every unit they sell or every unit they place on the market. And then in the background, they have the evidence or the justification of how they reached that point. So if you understand that, you'll see that it's very, very different to the North American approach. So for the RED, do I need to test it? Obviously, when we talked about the USA and Canada, the answer was yes, yes, yes. For the RED, well, there's nothing in the RED that actually mandates testing, but the RED does mandate an assessment, a technical assessment. And so that's why most people do test. You either fully test to harmonized standards, or you test at least equivalent or assess at least equivalent to the standards, and you go to a notified body. But if you go to a notified body for a type examination certificate, then they're going to expect to see at least equivalent evidence to have tested to as if you had tested to the standard. And if you get your notified body certificate, you're still expected to sign your declaration of conformity based on your own assessment. So the most common route is to fully test to all published or harmonized standards. And if those standards are listed on the official journal, then you get this presumption of conformity. So you don't have to test, but of course, most people do. They follow the standards correctly, and that gives them presumption of conformity. Most manufacturers like to have presumption of conformity, or at the very least do all they can to reduce their compliance risks. So if the manufacturer fully tests to the correct standards, they have the maximum amount of confidence and the shortest risk assessment. The whole EU compliance approach is heavily reliant on manufacturer integrity. So what have we learned then? Well, assessing each product is a mandatory step in the process. The declaration of conformity by the manufacturer is the authorization, and it applies for each model or variant or unit, because each unit that you sell or place on the market is going to be shipped with a declaration. The declaration goes in the box and it states this unit complies with the red. So if you've fully tested one unit and then you've formed some other sort of assessment on a similar unit, the unit you've done the own assessment on, you're still shipping that with a declaration to state that you have assessed it to the Radio Equipment Directive. But the manufacturer does have some flexibility to do that without full testing, but they must be able to justify their approach. And of course, if they haven't fully applied a harmonized standard, they would need the notified body certificate. And of course, the notified body is going to expect to see all the evidence of compliance. So if you change a product, this is the same slide as we had before. Let's say you've got a product, you've fully tested it, you've been CE marking it, and you've been selling it, and now you've made a change to that product. You've got to track all the changes of the product through its life, and you're going to have to reassess it. There's no certification or registration phase with the red, and therefore there's no permissive change. It's all about the manufacturer doing a reassessment of their product, because the declaration of conformity that they ship with the product applies to each new unit on each day that they ship. So if you've made some hardware change to a product, of course, you're going to need to reassess because of the changes. Most likely it will be some retesting, but it could be some sort of justifications and reassessment. It is legally permitted to do a justification or assessment without testing, and that may not invalidate the authorization. As long as you've got your declaration of conformity in place, then the product is authorized. And then the justification or evidence of how you got there is almost a separate topic, if you like. You do have to maintain the technical documentation, however, and update your risk assessment. So if, for example, you are shipping a product that you didn't test, and market surveillance or a customer or ask a notified body or whoever asks to see the evidence, you can't just say, well, we didn't do anything. I was on a webinar, Michael said we didn't have to test it, so we thought we'd just ship it. You do have to have some sort of clear evidence that is not just a guess of like, well, we didn't have much money and we didn't think it would probably affect the test results much, so we decided to just go for it. That wouldn't be a very good justification. Okay, so again, arriving on day one with multiple models for your assessment for Europe. The DOC is by the manufacturer for each of those units or each of those models. The manufacturer is expected to have technical documentation and a justification of compliance for each model. They would have fully applied the harmonized standard to each one, or at least maybe have a notified body. Now, if you've got multiple very similar models, you might decide that you have fully applied a harmonized standard by doing any test which could change on all of them, and other tests on only one of them, for example. Similar to how we talked earlier in this webinar about not repeating conducted antenna port test cases, for example. Assessing your product to all the requirements, and then the authorization route for Europe does allow the manufacturer to perform assessments. A notified body's role is not the same as a TCB's role. Whereas a TCB must check that everything was done absolutely correctly, the notified body, their role is a little bit more flexible, and they are kind of graced with a bit more power to make interpretations or judgments. But of course, you got to remember it's not a certification by the notified body as such. Although it is a certificate issued to a 17065 accreditation, the reality is it's a type examination certificate issued to the manufacturer, and then the manufacturer still has to sign their DOC, even in cases when a notified body certificate was received. So the notified body does a technical evaluation requiring evidence, and they're checking for compliance with the scope of the RED. Notified bodies are expected to fully understand EMC and to understand, the concept and the testing. So if you go to a notified body and say, we've got a unit here, it's got different hardware, but we chose not to test it, so can we just have a notified body certificate? Hopefully the notified body knows enough about EMC testing to say, well, without any evidence, how can we know it complies? So with the test lab then and partial testing, let's go back to the same slide we had before. You've got a fully tested Model A, partially tested Model B. The lab must test what it was told to test and report what it actually tested. Well, with the Radio Equipment Directive and the EMC Directive, if the product isn't radio, the manufacturer applies the standard to Model B, and maybe the manufacturer can gather enough evidence to show that the Model B complies with the standard, because the manufacturer's role is to assess the product to the standard. Now, of course, these are test standards, and so testing the unit to the standard is often going to end up being the way you have to proceed, and it really is the most common way. But of course, the system does allow some flexibility for the manufacturer to perform an assessment. But again, the role of the lab and the manufacturer is very clear here. The role of the lab is to test what they're told to test and report the results. And if anybody is going to decide that partially tested Model B complies with the directive by complying with the standard, only the manufacturer can make that decision. A lab can't say, we fully tested Model A, we partially tested Model B, but we think Model B would have passed if we'd fully tested it. That's not part of a lab's role. So it's time for some engineering judgment in Europe. The EU RED does allow some consideration and risk on the behalf of the manufacturer. Partial assessment is okay as long as they can show that they meet the requirements. The manufacturer must be able to explain and justify everything, and they must be able to consider all the tests that could be affected. And of course, testing can often be quicker than trying to write these justifications. A lot of manufacturers and a lot of compliance manufacturers will have received the message from their boss, please do all you can to reduce our costs in the test lab. Please reduce our test and certification costs as much as you can. And that's something that most compliance managers have in the forefront of their mind. But what their boss really means is, please do all you can to reduce our test and certification costs, but whatever you do, do not jeopardize our time to market, launch date, and do not leave us selling a non-compliant product. And of course, with Europe, the DOC applies to the one that it's shipped with. So even if you've got a unit that you didn't fully test and you perform some sort of judgment or assessment on, somebody is signing to state that that unit complies with the Radio Equipment Directive. So some common mistakes then, not tracking hardware changes in your product range, not keeping the declaration of conformity up to date, trying to avoid testing and guessing worst case models without actually having some evidence. I've been involved in situations where a group of people in smart clothes and suits have sat around a conference room with pads of paper, looking at a list of model names saying, which one do we think will be the worst case? Again, anybody who's spent years EMC testing or product development will find that frightening and yet funny, but at the same time, because of course, the way to find out which one's worse is to perform some testing. Asking others to take responsibility, such as asking a test lab to partially test a model but state it complies. Having incomplete paperwork and admin, too many justifications and it being a really complicated paper trail, and not realizing that small product changes can affect the EMC. Okay, so the test lab tests what it's told. The test lab can do partial testing. There's no problem with that. and the lab reports what it tested. The lab must accurately report what it tested, and then the manufacturer's role is to derive compliance from the results. Even if you fully test to every aspect of a harmonized standard, when you come away from the lab, it's not just a case of I passed, therefore I've got my CE mark now. The manufacturer should look at the test report, should look at the test results and say, well, okay, I've tested now, but what about the units I'm actually selling? Will they pass? Have we got a clear enough pass margin that all those units we ship with a DOC in the box, will they all actually comply? And if you've used any sort of evidence or justification for partial testing, then of course that's amplified even more. So that is a role, though, of the lab to do the testing, and a role of the manufacturer to decide whether to sign their DOC or not. The lab cannot claim it tested something it did not, and the manufacturer should make the final decision on whether the product is compliant with the RED or not, or the EMC directive if it doesn't have a radio in it. The manufacturer should never ask the lab to claim that it tested something it did not. Okay, so our focus here has been on the North American and European markets, but hopefully you've seen that there's a really clear process and procedure. This whole webinar really is based on the mistakes I see people making, but also issues that have been highlighted to us here at Element by the FCC and by ISED Canada, where they're looking very closely at this topic. So what are the global consequences of the things I've discussed today? Well, pretty common sense, really, in these last couple of minutes. Many regions around the world do rely on the FCC or Radio Equipment Directive compliance approach. For example, there's many countries around the world that will use the EU test reports for their own global market access or their own regulatory approvals. So, for example, for the Radio Equipment Directive, you don't need an accredited test lab, but there's many countries around the world that will say, well, we'll accept an EU compliant report to a ETSI EN standard, for example, but we need to see it be an accredited report. So sometimes the manufacturer will come to us and say, are you accredited for this EN standard for CE marking? And we'll say, yes, we are. You know, just so you're aware, you don't need to have accredited lab. And they'll say, yeah, but we're going to use these results for other regions' global market access. So that's an important thing. Sometimes the country may accept the same approach as Europe, whereby they'll allow the manufacturer to do full testing on one unit and a partial testing and assessment on another unit. However, some regions may say, right, we'll allow that, but we do want to see an actual test report for each model. And that's okay, as long as there's test results for each model. Because, of course, how is the test lab going to issue a report for a model if they haven't been asked to test it? So it's very important to check your global market access plan before you schedule your testing. If you go for the CE marking approach first, and then later go for the global market access, that's fine, that's possible, but you may need to go back and do some additional testing. So if the manufacturer wants a full pretty test report for all models, perhaps for some GMA or global market access requirements, then they may need to ask the lab to just fully test all models, and then that could save them time later on. So hopefully you've enjoyed this webinar today. It's a lot to talk about. I probably could have talked all day. Those that know me know I could at least have talked for another day or two. Here at Element, we offer advisory services, pre-compliance test and evaluation, accredited tests and certification, and global market access. So a lot of the time people do come to us and say, look, we're going to be coming to you for final testing, and we know that when we come in for final testing, you're going to ask us to put the unit into its worst case mode and its worst case configuration, but we don't know what that is yet. And so a lot of our time will be helping manufacturers to understand that. And for Europe, they might say, right, well, when we do our final testing, we only really want to do it on our worst case one, but we don't know what that is until we've tested. So let's do some investigations together. Okay, so let's open it up for questions now. I will pass back to Laura and we'll see if there are any questions. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks. Thanks, Michael. That's a great presentation. I'd also like to welcome Lydia Wilkinson, if she can put her camera on as well. She'll answer. Oh, here she is. Hi, Lydia. She's based in our whole lab within the UK, and she's going to just be on the Q&A section to answer any questions on global market access as well. So, hi, Lydia, welcome, and we'll just go through a few of the questions now. Right. So the first one we've had in is for a product that uses a certified built-in Bluetooth radio, is any additional EMC testing required for compliance, or can the manufacturer's certifications be used?
Okay. Yes. Oh, is there a bit of echo? Do I need to? Okay. Maybe if you guys mute yourself. Anyway, yeah. So the very important thing then is to separate the two different topics of testing and certification, and they're very different. They're kind of linked, but people think, oh, well, it's certified, so I don't need to test it. And so people take an approved module and they put it into their product. So now the USA and Canada, they have product certification. So the module can be certified so that the hardware description, the circuit diagram, everything like that is registered with the FCC in Canada. So then when that module is installed into another product, that end product doesn't need the certification step because the certification was handled by the module manufacturer. But nobody has any evidence that the product and the module in it passes the tests. So you're in a situation where you need to retest, but you don't need to recertify. So the answer to the question of do I need to do EMC testing or can I rely on the module certification? The answer is yes and yes. You do have to do your testing again, but you don't have to do your certification again in most cases. And Europe doesn't have certification, so we don't have modular approvals. The CE mark on a module for Europe is to allow the module manufacturer to sell the module in Europe. Before you ask your next question, I was just skimming through some of the questions, and there's lots of people have asked variations of the same thing, and it makes me realize that I've spent the last hour talking about hardware variations, and I didn't really go into software variations. So I'll maybe if I quickly talk about that, and then we can probably consider most of the questions about software have been answered. So the FCC rules are old, they're even older than me. And so they are all written around the concept of product hardware. And sure, so same again with the Radio Equipment Directive, it's written around the concept of an apparatus, a product. However, it's all fully understood that software and firmware can change a product, and a product can go from passing or failing with a firmware change or a software change. So if we look at the FCC and Canada first, you're certifying a product based on its hardware. And if you were to change the transmitter hardware, it needs a new certification. But if you were to make other non-transmitter hardware changes, you could do this permissive change bit. I think everyone gets that. Well, software changes come under that same category. So software or firmware, if you make a change to it, the manufacturer is expected to evaluate, has my software change made any difference? And it might be a really easy answer, like you did have Bluetooth frequency hopping and now you've enabled Bluetooth low energy mode, or let's say you had a form of Zigbee type or LoRa and you've changed the bandwidth of a signal. Well, obviously you've affected the transmitter performance, and depending on your type of certification, you can usually add that through a class 2 permissive change. And Canada actually has a class 3 permissive change for firmware changes in a product. The USA also has a class 3 permissive change for software defined radios, but most people misunderstand what software defined radios are. And then in Europe, there is a section in the red about the software. There's Article 3.3i and there's Article 4 of the red. Both deal with software and firmware, but neither of those sections are enabled. So it's really just about the manufacturer making sure they sell a compliant product. And if they make a change to the software or firmware, although it's not clearly written anywhere, they do have to reevaluate and reassess to make sure the product they sell still passes. And as a few people have commented, yeah, I've seen really simple little firmware changes cause a product to go from passing to failing. All right, thanks.
Thank you. So another question we've had in, for the FCC into the USA and ISED into Canada, when installing a pre-certified module into another product, is there a way to avoid fully retesting the end device?
Yes, so having just said that when you install a certified module into your end product and you have to test, it is okay to not fully retest everything. So on the module, some of the testing, so let's say it's a Wi-Fi or Bluetooth or cellular, then a lot of that testing would have been conducted antenna port measurements, you know, how often does it hop? How many channels does it hop over? How wide is the signal? Things like that. And if you take a pre-certified radio module and install it into your product and you haven't changed any of those parameters, then you can justify not retesting those conducted antenna port test cases, because you can say, well, didn't change them. But all of the radiated emissions or radiated performance, or if it's a type of transmitter where the output power was measured as a radiated value, then all of those would need to be repeated on the end product. And SAR testing, if that's needed, is always on the end product.
Thank you. And for the FCC in Canada, does the permissive change testing need to be done in an accredited test lab?
Okay, so if you go to a TCB for a class 2 permissive change, or Canada for a class 2 or 3 or 4 permissive change, those are actual certification type projects through the TCB, and those have to be done by an accredited lab that's listed for that type of testing. However, there's an initial step of the manufacturer making a change to their product, and then the manufacturer deciding if their change has made the emissions better or worse than it was before. That decision by the manufacturer could be done in a non-accredited lab. You know, if they've got their own measurement facilities, for example, let's say they first test their product in an accredited lab and then they rush home, test their product in their own chamber. And then when they make changes to the products, they can keep retesting in their own chamber to see, have I made it worse? Have I made it better? Or they could go back to their local test lab and say, I just need a quick check. But if they decide it's a class 1 permissive change, then that's okay. If they then decide they need to do a class 2 permissive change, then the results need to come from an accredited lab.
Okay, thank you. We've got quite a few more questions to go through still. So next one.
If we run out of time, we can email people the answers, I'm sure.
Yeah. So the next one I've got here is, why are there no radiated and conducted immunity requirements for the FCC?
Yeah, that's a philosophical question, and luckily before my time, I guess. I've only been doing this about 35 years. But if I had to make a guess, I would go about the fact that in the USA, it's all about you're not going to interfere with somebody else. And so if you make a licensed transmitter, you are paying for using that frequency band, and you transmit high powers and you're allowed high emissions. And at the moment, there's no receiver tests, although there might be in the future. There are a couple of tests. There's contention-based protocol and DFS, which are tests to check when it will transmit. And they're kind of associated with the receiver, but they're not strictly receiver tests. So it's all about what am I putting on to something else. And the same with the emissions. It's all about what am I putting out to something else. And in fact, with a Part 15 device, there's a funny little 2-part statement that goes on the label for FCC products. And firstly, it says, my product won't interfere with anybody else's, because you've done it testing, right? And then the second one is, if somebody else's product interferes with my product, tough luck. you know, I accept that that's a consequence. And you know, it's very much that kind of, well, you should have bought a better product, or if you're really aggrieved, you could sue the person. So I'm somewhat infamous for my politically incorrect jokes, so I'm going to be really careful. But yeah, I think in the USA, it's like very much you get what you pay for. And if you didn't get a good one, you should have paid more. And if you really feel like somebody's done you wrong, then maybe you call your lawyer. Whereas in Europe, the political approach is a lot more socialist, and so there's a lot more kind of respect for the consumer, and the sort of strength of the CE mark almost as a kind of a quality mark almost. And so if you buy a product with a CE mark on it, whether you spent £30 on it or £300 or £1,000 on it, you're expecting to get a product that works. If it says it's a Bluetooth speaker, it should always work. If it says it's a mobile phone, it should always work. So that thing doesn't really, that sort of quality aspect doesn't really translate across to the USA. It does maybe if you've got medical, because of course there's a safety consequence to a medical device not working. Thanks.
Thank you. Right, so the next question we've got here is, how do the rule changes from FCC R&O 22-84 impact equipment authorizations? Is the process altered?
Okay, yeah. So I'm going to confess that I've been traveling for the last 3 weeks, and it's all been happening in that time. And so I'm desperately trying to keep up on this topic. But the basic concept is, so a lot of people will understand that for years, if you go to Canada, if you're selling a product to Canada, as part of your application, you need an in-country representative for Canada. That person needs to be registered with Canada, and they need to have a Canadian address. And then for the USA, for certification, there's never been an equivalent for that. There is for SDOC. For SDOC for the USA, you have to have the name and address of an American company written on your user manual. But for certification, there wasn't one, that you could just be a registered grantee from anywhere in the world. Well, the USA, the FCC has been making a lot of changes lately, especially around kind of responsibility of the manufacturer and who exactly is the manufacturer. And so there are new requirements now that manufacturers, if they're in the USA, they can deal with it themselves. But if any manufacturer is outside the USA, they'll need an in-country representative who needs to be registered with the FCC. They need to have a federal registration number, FRN, and they can't be associated with a test lab or a TCB. So like a procedure or process change there. That's my loose understanding from trying frantically to check emails on my phone while I'm between airports. Thanks. I saw a question just while you're looking, Laura. I just saw one that said, is there a central sort of base of notified body EU certificates like there is for the FCC? And I've heard that question before, and the answer is simply is no. So with the FCC, it's a registration, it's a form of certification. Everything's publicly available online, and the FCC grant, you can go and look and you can see all the certified products. I think we've lost Laura, but I can see the question, so that's okay. And so with the FCC, all of the certifications are on the FCC website, and so are the documents. For Canada, the certified products are all on the Canadian website, and you can see the model numbers. Soon they're going to change it so we can also see all the test reports and all the forms and everything. So they're going to make all that, photographs and everything will all become public soon. In Europe, there is no equivalent because it's all declaration of conformity by the manufacturer. And the notified body certificate is a kind of private document from the notified body to the manufacturer to say, I've reviewed your product and I think it meets the red. And so it's that. The only couple of exceptions to that rule are if a notified body refuses to issue a certificate for some reason. Like, let's say, for example, a product comes into a notified body says there's something wrong with it, I can't issue a certificate, and then the manufacturer refuses to fix it or goes away or whatever, the notified body has to upload the details of that project to a database that can be seen by all the other notified bodies. But no, it's not a public database. And similarly, if a harmonized standard exists for a manufacturer, but the manufacturer chooses not to apply it, then they go to the notified body, and the notified body issues the certificate, and then the notified body must send that certificate to the European Commission and the Market Surveillance Authority. And again, that's not a public database. Okay, so we seem to have lost Laura, but I'm sure I can squeeze on down. Lots of questions about firmware. I really apologize that I didn't talk more about firmware. Probably if you had let me talk for a whole day, I probably would have got round to it. Since cybersecurity is now part of a delegated act, will we have cyber standards identified for the RED, and will these be harmonized standards? Okay, so at the beginning of 2022, the European Commission published a delegated regulation saying cybersecurity is going to be a thing for products connected directly or indirectly to the internet, and things like used for monetary transfer, financial transactions, things like that, and things that are used for like wearable devices used by children, things like that. So a very broad statement, but at least you know who you were then. And then in September 2022, they issued a standardization request, which is basically saying, here's the kind of things you need to address. So they're not test cases, they're like, this is what we think the standards should include. Senelec has been writing the standard or the standards, the 3 standards, and they are in progress of doing that. I'm part of the group. I missed a lot of those meetings, but I'm part of the group, and I've been helping out with like how the RED works as such. And at the moment, they're hoping to complete those standards by December 2023. And then they would hopefully become listed harmonized standards in time for the regulation to sort of kick in on the 1st of August 2024. So there's no requirement to list it on your declaration of conformity until August 2024. In fact, notified bodies can't really do anything yet, and if they could, if you did issue a certificate now, it wouldn't even become a legal document until the 1st of August 2024, by which time it would most likely have expired because the test cases would have changed. Okay, I saw a question about oh yeah, I want to verify for North America, immunity and product safety are not required, but RF exposure and radiated emissions are required. Yeah, so for North America, for the FCC, you would find it very hard to sell a product without a safety assessment. You know, if whoever you're selling it through, whether it's like Walmart or Radio Shack, or just Radio Shack still exists, or any one of those, or you're selling it to a phone network, or you know, some other online store, they're probably going to ask for a safety assessment. But again, safety is historically like EMC immunity. Like if somebody hurts you, you sue them. And so it's actually very unlikely that you would be able to sell a product without some sort of safety mark, because whoever you're selling through isn't going to want to touch it. But it's not a legal requirement as part of the FCC. The emissions and transmitter performance and RF exposure are parts of the FCC. Radio equipment regulations for the UK, I did cover that. It was kind of a copy and paste at the time of beginning of 2021. And so the radio equipment regulation for the UK does look very similar to the radio equipment directive. The only things I would say is that the radio equipment directive in Europe has a list of harmonized standards, and the UK's radio regulation has a list of designated standards. And sometimes those lists are the same, sometimes they're not quite the same. And they were copied across, the regulation was copied across before the EU enabled its Article 3.3 cases. So emergency calling for mobile phones and cybersecurity and things like that are not part of the UK regulation. Right, what else?
Wanting to jump in, Michael, if that's okay.
Yeah, please do. Go for it. If you've seen a question to answer, that'd be brilliant. Well,
I've been having a little trouble with the question box, so forgive me, guys, if there's something you've asked me directly. But let me just introduce myself a little bit. So I'm a sales engineer. I work in the sales department, and part of what I do every day is quote for certifications globally. Typically, we deem those territories outside of the UK, EU, US, and Canada. So although I've not seen any specific questions regarding global territories per se, it's worth mentioning that, as Michael said earlier, a lot of the CE test reports you'll receive from an accredited test house like Element give you that foot in the door for a lot of these global territories. They may request to see that documentation as the initial process to get into those territories, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that process stops there. So if you have a radio product and we use Mexico for an example, there are certain mandatory requirements for territories such as Mexico. So they will ask you for your CE documents and your CE test reports, your declaration of conformity, etc. But they will also put in place their own in-country certification that's mandatory. Now, there are some countries that will perform a documentation review, and there are some countries that will require in-country testing. It's mandatory either way. Some are just far easier than others to get into. I always use Mexico as an example because they have NOM certification for safety and IFTEL certification for radio and telecoms. So it's something worth considering when, as Michael said, you may not necessarily choose to go down the accredited route for test reports, be that for safety, radio and EMC. They all sort of fall under the same bracket in terms of self-declaration to a degree, but it is worth noting that these territories, if you have markets that you know that you're going to be selling into, that they are highly likely, if not always, going to be asking you for those accredited reports. And that's something that we at Element do all the time. We have a global market access department, very well versed in the worldwide requirements for certifications. But if you've got further questions, just either let us know now or pop it in the survey and we'll make sure we answer them.
Cool, that's good. Thank you, Lydia. I focus so much on the sort of test and certification of the standard, you know, North America and Europe. It's good to have your input on those other regions.
Yes, it can come as a surprise sometimes when people will say, well, the standards are harmonized, and it's like, yes, they are, but they're still going to request some form of certification. So it's worth mentioning at the beginning, especially if you've got a marketing plan, because some of those countries may affect not just your radio testing, not just your EMC, but your safety testing as well. There are deviations that have to be included as part of your safety testing. Perfect example is Australia. There are so many harmonised standards for Australia. So if that's the direction you're going into, it's worth mentioning to your test house or your compliance team internally right at the beginning, at the developmental stage of a project. Because it's going to have a domino effect later on with the worldwide certifications.
Yeah, cool, thank you. That's given me a time to read another question or two as well. Thank you for that. So one of the questions was, if 5% of products that go through a TCB have to go through audit surveillance testing, is there basically an equivalent in Europe? So no, because most products for Europe don't go anywhere near a certification body. They are just tested and DOC by the manufacturer. Now, the red does state that the manufacturer is expected to do sample testing. It doesn't state how much or how often. That's up to every manufacturer. So you could argue that the manufacturer is responsible for their own surveillance testing. The notified body doesn't. If a notified body reviews a project, they don't have to do surveillance on it, but market surveillance is handled in Europe by each of the regulators. So every one of the 27 different countries in the EU, they have to do market surveillance each year, and then report their findings up to the European Commission. For FCC testing, in the case of a permissive change, who is allowed to do the testing for the results to be allowed? Right, okay, so pretty much anybody can do the testing. So let's say, for example, you've got a product and you've changed it. You could go to the same lab you did before or a different one. The FCC rules are really written by lawyers, really. I hope I offend any lawyers on the call, but there's a kind of assumption that if you test in one lab one day and then you test another unit years later in a different lab, you should get the exact same results. I suspect any EMC engineer out there is laughing at that concept, but you should be able to go and do permissive changes in any lab. Now, as for who kind of orders the testing, let's say you've taken somebody else's product, you've rebranded it, you've done a change in ID or something, you could do that testing yourself. Also then, let's say you've taken somebody's radio module and you've installed somebody's radio module into your product, you've retested the product, but you're using the module manufacturer's certification. And then let's say you want to change the antenna. So you know that a change in the antenna requires a class 2 permissive change. So you could do that testing, but you don't own the certification. So only the module manufacturer could do the class 2 permissive change. Or if you make some minor change to the hardware that constitutes a class 1 permissive change, you can't store that yourself because you're not the manufacturer of the mod, you're not the grantee, the one with the FCC grant. You'd have to inform the module manufacturer. Or you do a change in ID so that you become the grantee, the grant holder, and then you can process it. But often I'll hear people saying, I installed somebody else's module, I made a change, and I did a permissive change. You go, well, how have you done a permissive change on somebody else's certification? It's a legal process. Next question, is all modern digital equipment now covered by RED? Or must all the equipment still comply with other directives like EMC, EMF, etc.? And must the DOC include only the RED or all the necessary directives? Right, okay, so firstly, the RED only includes products which have a radio function in it. But EMC, safety, and radio are in the RED. So let's say I've got a screen next to me here. It's just an electronic device, just a piece of electronics. It doesn't have any radio in it. So the EMC directive and the low voltage directive would apply to that product. Now let's say you put a GPS receiver in it, or an RFID chip, or Wi-Fi or Bluetooth or something. I put somebody else's module in it, or I design it in, or even if I put a CE marked module inside it, whatever, it's now radio equipment. So now it's in scope of the RED. So I would put the RED on my declaration of conformity, but I would not put the EMC directive or the low voltage directive on my DOC, because those directives do not apply anymore, because the EMC and safety testing is covered in the RED. And RF exposure is also covered in the RED, so that would be part of that. You wouldn't really list the EMF directive on a product, because the EMF directive is all about an environment, like a safe working place as such. So typically a radio product, the DOC does have to list all applicable CE marking directives. So typically it would list, for example, the radio equipment directive and the ROS, very common ones. Okay. Oh yeah, okay, quick question. We've probably only got a couple of minutes left, and then this webinar thing might boot us off. Thank you very much. I see a lot of people still on the call, which is nice to see. For the FCC, when you were looking for multiple models under certification, that clause I said about if you want to do one test for multiple models, they've got to be identical. As per 2.931, it says that they must be identical within the variation that can be expected due to quality production and testing on a statistical basis. It doesn't mean you're allowed to make variations. It means if you've got identical products, it's kind of their way of saying, I do know that if you had 100 identical products with identical components coming off of the same production line, you would see minor changes. That's what they're kind of saying. So many questions. It's good. I think I'm going to have some emailing to do. Is Great Britain going to implement the equivalent cyber to the radio regulations? So no, not really, because with the Radio Equipment Directive in August 2024, we're going to get the cyber requirements for the Radio Equipment Directive come in, but they'll only be in for a little while, because then the Cyber Resilience Act will come in. And the Cyber Resilience Act will cover all digital equipment, which will include radio equipment and software. And that will come in Europe. And when that comes in, they will repeal the cyber security requirements in the Radio Equipment Directive. The UK has its own cyber plans. I would like to think that hopefully the cyber plans for the UK will be somewhat similar to the future Cyber Resilience Act in the EU. But in the meantime, the UK isn't planning to replicate the Radio Equipment Directive requirements. Oh, this is a good question. For medical products, how does 60601-1-2 relate to the RED? So that is a good question. A lot of the time, especially people in America, you have this very much, you authorize different aspects of a product. So let's say you've got a Wi-Fi enabled laptop for North America, you would certify the Wi-Fi and you would do testing, SDOC or certification on the digital device part, and the different authorizations that lead to the authorization of the end product. And if you've got a medical device for North America, the digital device part would be exempt from the FCC rules, but the radio you've put in it would require an FCC certification. So making medical connected in the USA has suddenly meant that the medical industry has to learn all about the FCC, which is something they'd always assumed they were exempt from. Now, across in Europe, the RED assessment covers everything of that product, covers every aspect. Even if the RED applies and also the medical regulation applies, there's this big Venn diagram type of thing. So let's say you've got, under the RED requirements, you've got the radio performance. Let's say you've got a Bluetooth enabled medical device. So the Article 3.2, the radio part, you'll test to 300, 328, radio performance, that's all very simple. Then under EMC and safety, you go, well, I could test it as an IT equipment, but that doesn't make any sense. And that under here, under the medical regulation, I've already done full EMC and safety testing to the 60601 standards. So if I've already tested it for EMC and safety as a medical device, and I've done my additional radio part, and I've done my additional EN 301489 testing for EMC of the radio link, but how do I show compliance with Article 3.1a and 3.1b of the RED for EMC and product safety? Well, the answer is those 60601-1-2 or whatever, that the safety and EMC assessment of it as a medical device could be used as part of your assessment under Article 3.1a of the RED. So on your declaration of conformity, and you're listing which standards did you apply, you would list the radio, EMC and safety standards, and the EMC and safety standards might be medical. And exact same answer I would give if we were talking automotive or machinery or toy safety or anything like that. I've seen cases where people have had like a medical device, and then they've done safety testing to EN 62368 and as an IT product, and I go, why did you do that? And they said, well, we thought we needed to do that for the RED. Okay, but you've tested it for safety extensively as a medical device. And they go, yeah, but I didn't think I could put my medical safety standard under the RED heading of my DOC. And I go, yes, you absolutely can do that. So hopefully that answers that question. All right, I think we're at 5 o'clock. People have just started to drop off. I know that we've probably lost Laura. But I think we've got a list of all the questions. If there was one or two more questions, I would say let's keep going. I think we've got so many that it might be a time to wrap it up. I suspect lots of American people have got their day ahead of them. A lot of people in Asia want to go to bed. In the UK, it's tea time, and in Europe, it's dinner time. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much, Lydia.
Just before we go, Michael, there is a short survey that will appear on screen, I think just shortly after the webinar's finished. So if you wouldn't mind sort of taking part in that survey so we can get your feedback. And yeah, thank you all for your time.
Cool. Thank you very much. Lydia, do you want me to close the webinar? Or,
I'll let you do that, yeah.
All right. Okay, well, hopefully it will close, and thank you all very much for attending and for staying on the call. Thanks very much.